The rain fell steadily on the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace, creating small rivers that flowed toward the ornate gates, where two Queen's guards stood at attention. Their red uniforms remained pristine despite the weather, their black bearskin hats towering above their heads like silent sentinels. For hours, they had maintained their posts without moving, their faces hidden behind the traditional stoic mask that had become their trademark. Among the gathering crowd of tourists, a small figure caught the attention of passers-by. 8-year-old Emily Watson pressed her face against the cold metal bars of the palace gates, her breath creating small clouds of fog against the iron. She wore a faded pink raincoat that had seen better days, and her shoes squelched with each step as water had long since seeped through the worn soles. Emily had been waiting for 3 hours. Her grandmother had promised to bring her to see the guards during their school holiday, but the old woman had fallen ill that morning. Determined not to miss her chance, Emily had saved her pocket money for weeks to take the bus alone from her council flat in East London. She clutched a crumpled drawing in her small hands, protected by a plastic bag her mother had given her for packed lunches. The drawing showed 2 guards standing tall and proud, colored with red and black crayons. Beneath it, in her careful handwriting, she had written, "Thank you for keeping everyone safe. From Emily, age 8. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd began to thin. Parents pulled reluctant children away from the gates, promising to return another day when the weather was better. Shop owners closed their umbrellas and retreated indoors. But Emily remained, her eyes fixed on the guards who seemed as unmovable as the palace itself. Guard James Mitchell had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 7 years. At 28, he had perfected the art of remaining motionless for hours, of ignoring the tourists who tried to make him laugh or react. His training had taught him that his duty was sacred, that he represented something greater than himself. But as he stood there in the rain, he couldn't help but notice the small girl, who refused to leave. Through his peripheral vision, he watched her. She didn't try to get his attention like other children did. She didn't make faces or shout. She simply waited, patient and quiet, occasionally looking down at something in her hands. When a strong gust of wind nearly knocked her over, she steadied herself against the gate and continued her vigil. The changing of the guard was still 2 hours away. Emily's lips had turned slightly blue from the cold, and she shivered despite trying to hide it. She had counted the money in her pocket 3 times, knowing she had just enough for the bus ride home, but not enough to buy anything warm to drink or eat. A group of American tourists approached the gate, cameras ready. They laughed loudly and posed for pictures, asking each other if they thought the guards were real people or just statues. One teenage boy picked up a small stone and pretended to throw it at the guards, causing his friends to giggle. Emily turned and gave them a stern look that would have made the Queen herself proud. "They're real people," she said quietly but firmly. "They're doing an important job." The teenagers laughed and moved on, but Emily's words carried across the courtyard. Guard Mitchell felt something stir in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with his thick uniform. In 7 years of service, he had heard every possible comment from tourists, but never had a child defended him with such simple dignity. As the rain continued to fall, Emily opened her plastic bag and carefully examined her drawing. The colors had run slightly from the moisture, but the image was still clear. She folded it back up and looked toward the guard post, her young mind working on a problem that seemed impossible to solve. The palace protocol was clear. Guards were not to interact with the public during their duty. They were to remain silent, still, and focused on their responsibilities. Breaking this protocol could result in serious disciplinary action. But as Guard Mitchell watched the small girl in the faded raincoat, he found himself thinking about his own daughter, safe and warm at home with his wife. Emily made a decision. She carefully placed her drawing under a small rock near the gate, weighing it down so the wind wouldn't carry it away. Then she stepped back and gave a small, respectful curtsy, the way she had seen in movies about princesses. She didn't expect anything in return. She simply wanted to show her appreciation for what she believed was important work. What happened next would be talked about for years by those who witnessed it. Guard Mitchell, maintaining his forward gaze, executed a movement so subtle that most people missed it entirely. He shifted his weight almost imperceptibly and tilted his head downward by the smallest fraction of a degree. It lasted only a moment, but Emily saw it clearly. Her face lit up with a smile that seemed to brighten the entire gray afternoon. She pressed her hand to her heart and nodded, understanding that she had been acknowledged by someone she considered a hero. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the bus stop, her steps lighter, despite the rain that continued to fall. Guard Mitchell remained at his post for another hour and 45 minutes, until the changing of the guard. But something had changed in him during those few moments of connection. The weight of his responsibility felt different now, more personal and meaningful. He thought about the little girl who had stood in the rain for hours, not seeking entertainment or spectacle, but simply wanting to express gratitude. When his replacement arrived and the formal changing ceremony began, Guard Mitchell completed his duties with the same precision he always maintained. But as he marched away from his post, he glanced quickly toward the spot where Emily had placed her drawing. It was still there, the colors bleeding, but the heart behind it as clear as ever. Later that evening, after he had changed out of his uniform and completed all his official duties, James Mitchell returned to the palace gates as a civilian. He retrieved the small drawing and read the simple message written in a child's careful handwriting. The paper was soggy and the colors had run together, but it would become one of his most treasured possessions. The summer heat beat down mercilessly on the parade ground at Windsor Castle, where Trooper Sarah Williams stood perfectly still in her ceremonial uniform. Sweat trickled down her back beneath the heavy red tunic, but her expression remained unchanged. She had been standing guard for nearly 2 hours, and the temperature had climbed to an uncomfortable 32 degrees Celsius. In the distance, she could see a wedding party making their way across the castle grounds. It was a small, intimate ceremony, nothing like the grand royal affairs that usually took place here. The bride wore a simple white dress, and the groom looked nervous as he adjusted his tie for the 100th time. What caught Sarah's attention, however, was the elderly man in a wheelchair being pushed slowly behind them. The man appeared to be in his 90s, his frail frame dwarfed by the large military medals that decorated his chest. Even from her position, Sarah could see the unmistakable ribbons of World War II service medals, including what looked like the Distinguished Flying Cross. His head shook slightly with age, but his eyes were alert and focused as he took in the majesty of the castle around him. As the wedding party moved closer to where Sarah stood guard, she could hear fragments of their conversation. The bride was explaining to her grandfather about the various buildings and their history. Her voice was gentle and patient, the way people speak to someone they love dearly. The old man listened intently, occasionally asking questions about the guards and their duties. "Grandpa served in the war," the bride told her new husband quietly. "He's always wanted to visit Windsor Castle, but we never had the chance before now." The elderly veteran's name was George Harrison, and at 94, he was one of the last surviving members of his Royal Air Force squadron. He had flown bombing missions over Germany during some of the darkest days of the war, watching friends disappear into the night sky and never return. Now, 6 decades later, he was finally seeing the castle he had helped defend from thousands of feet above. As the wheelchair approached Sarah's position, it suddenly stopped. One of the wheels had caught in a gap between the ancient cobblestones, and despite the grandson-in-law's efforts, it wouldn't budge. The wedding party gathered around, trying to solve the problem without drawing attention to themselves or disrupting the formal atmosphere of the castle grounds. George waved away their concerns with a weathered hand. "Don't fuss over me on your special day," he insisted, though Sarah could see the disappointment in his eyes as he realized he might not be able to complete the tour he had dreamed about for so long. The bride knelt beside her grandfather's wheelchair, her white dress spreading around her on the cobblestones. "We'll figure this out, Grandpa. You're going to see everything, I promise." But the wheel remained stubbornly stuck, and the family's attempts to free it were becoming increasingly frustrated. Other tourists began to notice the commotion, and Sarah could see that the bride was becoming embarrassed about the scene they were creating. The groom checked his watch nervously, mindful that they had a reception to attend and guests waiting for them. Sarah had been trained extensively in the protocols of her position. Guards were not to abandon their posts except in cases of immediate danger. They were not to interact with tourists or involve themselves in civilian matters. Her sergeant's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her that discipline and duty were paramount to everything else. But as she watched the 94-year-old veteran struggle with the simple desire to see the castle he had helped protect, something deeper than training took over. Sarah thought about her own grandfather, who had served in the Royal Navy and had filled her childhood with stories of honor and service. She thought about what service really meant beyond the ceremonial duties and rigid protocols. Without breaking her stance or changing her expression, Sarah began to shift her weight in tiny increments. To any casual observer, she appeared to be adjusting her position in the normal way guards sometimes did during long periods of duty. But her movements were deliberate and calculated, bringing her gradually closer to where the wheelchair had become trapped. When she was close enough, she executed a movement that looked like a standard ceremonial turn, but positioned her directly beside the stuck wheel. In one fluid motion that appeared to be part of her regular duties, she used the heel of her polished boot to lever the wheel free from the gap in the cobblestones. The wheelchair rolled forward smoothly, and George looked up with surprise and delight. For a moment, his eyes met Sarah's, and she saw in them the gratitude of a man who had served his country with the same dedication she now demonstrated. Without breaking protocol or acknowledging what had happened, Sarah resumed her original position and stance. The bride looked up from where she knelt, tears forming in her eyes as she realized what the guard had done. The rest of the family understood immediately as well, though none of them said anything out loud. They simply reorganized themselves around the wheelchair and continued their tour, but the atmosphere had changed completely. George insisted on stopping when they were directly in front of Sarah's post. He studied her uniform, taking note of the regimental insignia and the precision of her bearing. Then, slowly and with great effort, he raised his right hand in a crisp military salute that showed decades of muscle memory and respect for the uniform she wore. Sarah's training demanded that she remain motionless, but the weight of the moment was overwhelming. Here was a man who had risked everything for the same crown she now served, showing her the respect that one soldier gives to another. After a brief internal struggle, she made a decision that would have made her grandfather proud. Almost imperceptibly, Sarah returned the salute. The movement was so subtle and brief that anyone not paying close attention would have missed it entirely. But George saw it clearly, and the smile that spread across his weathered face was worth every possible consequence she might face. The wedding party continued their tour, but George turned back twice to look at the guard who had helped him. Each time, Sarah remained perfectly still and professional, but there was something different in her bearing now, a connection that transcended the formal boundaries of her duty. Later that day, after the changing of the guard ceremony, Sarah learned that someone had taken a photograph of the moment when she and the veteran had exchanged salutes. The image would eventually find its way to the regimental commander, who would face a decision about whether to discipline Sarah for breaking protocol. But that same photograph would also reach the local newspapers, where the story of the guard who helped a war veteran would touch thousands of readers. Letters would pour in from veterans' families, thanking Sarah for showing the respect their loved ones deserved. The royal family themselves would eventually see the photograph and the story behind it. When Sarah was called before her commanding officer the following week, she expected the worst. Instead, she found herself being commended for demonstrating the true spirit of service that the Guard was meant to embody. The brief moment of humanity she had shown had reminded everyone that behind the ceremonial uniforms and rigid protocols were real people with real hearts. George Harrison would pass away peacefully 6 months later, but his family would always remember the day when a royal guard showed kindness to an old soldier. At his funeral, they would display the photograph of him saluting Sarah, a final reminder that respect and honor are not bound by age or circumstance. The autumn leaves swirled around the entrance to Horse Guards Parade as Corporal David Thompson took his position for the morning watch. The iconic building, with its grand arches and historic significance, attracted thousands of visitors each day. But today felt different. There was an unusual tension in the air, and David couldn't quite place what was causing it. As he settled into his ceremonial stance, David noticed a small commotion near the tourist information board. A woman in her 50s was speaking rapidly to a police officer, gesturing frantically while a young boy, perhaps 12 years old, stood silently beside her. The boy held a white cane and wore dark glasses, his head tilted slightly as he listened to the conversation around him. The woman was explaining something about a school trip that had gone wrong. Her son, Marcus, was part of a special program for visually impaired children who were visiting London's historic sites. The rest of his class had taken a different tour route, but Marcus had become separated from the group when he stopped to tie his shoe. By the time he realized what had happened, he could hear his classmates but couldn't determine which direction their voices were coming from. David listened carefully while maintaining his post. The police officer was being helpful but practical, explaining that the missing group had probably moved on to their next scheduled stop. He was arranging for Marcus and his mother to be transported to catch up with the class, but it would take at least an hour to organize and execute the plan. Marcus hadn't spoken during the entire exchange. He stood patiently beside his mother, his hand gripping his white cane with the confidence that comes from years of practice. But David could see the disappointment in the boy's posture. This was clearly an important day for him, and the confusion had ruined what should have been an exciting experience. "I really wanted to hear about the Horse Guards," Marcus finally said quietly to his mother. "Mrs. Peterson said they have hundreds of years of history, and I've been reading about them in Braille for weeks." His mother's face softened with understanding and frustration. She had been looking forward to this day as much as her son, knowing how much the historical aspects of the tour meant to him. Marcus had an exceptional memory for details and had prepared extensively for the visit, memorizing facts and dates that most adults would struggle to remember. "We'll come back another time," she promised, though they both knew that coordinating another trip would be complicated and expensive. This had been a special opportunity arranged through the school, with costs covered and transportation provided. Individual visits would be much more difficult to arrange. The police officer made some radio calls, trying to expedite the process, but it was clear that bureaucracy would take time. Other tourists began to gather around, some offering help, but mostly just curious about the situation. David could see that Marcus was becoming more withdrawn as the attention focused on him, his shoulders hunching slightly as he tried to make himself smaller. David had been serving as a horse guard for 4 years, and in that time, he had developed a deep appreciation for the history and traditions of his regiment. His own grandfather had served in the same unit during the Korean War, and family stories had instilled in him a profound respect for the heritage he now represented. More than anyone, he understood what this place meant to people who cared about history and tradition. As he watched the scene unfold, David found himself thinking about his younger brother, who had been born with a learning disability. Growing up, David had seen how much small acts of inclusion and understanding could mean to someone who faced daily challenges that others took for granted. He remembered the pride in his brother's face when people took time to treat him with dignity and respect. The crowd around Marcus and his mother began to disperse as the immediate drama subsided. But David continued to observe the situation. He could see that Marcus was trying to be brave, but there was obvious disappointment in his voice as he asked his mother questions about what they would do next. The boy had clearly been looking forward to this experience for a long time. David made a decision that went against every protocol in his training manual. Maintaining his forward-facing position and ceremonial bearing, he began to speak in a clear, carrying voice that seemed to be directed at no one in particular, as if he were reciting information for his own purposes. The Horse Guards building was completed in 1753, designed by William Kent and John Vardy, David announced in a formal tone that could easily be mistaken for some kind of official recitation. It serves as the official entrance to St. James's Palace and Buckingham Palace from Whitehall. Marcus stopped moving immediately, his head turning toward the source of the information. His mother looked confused at first, then understanding dawned on her face as she realized what the guard was doing. David continued his impromptu historical lecture, his voice carrying the authority and knowledge that came from years of study and service. The building replaced an earlier guardhouse that was built during the reign of Charles II. The current structure houses the Household Cavalry Museum and serves as the official London residence of the Life Guards and Blues and Royals. Marcus moved closer, his mother guiding him gently toward David's position. Other tourists began to stop and listen as well, drawn by the unusual experience of having a ceremonial guard provide detailed historical information. But David's words were clearly directed toward one specific listener. The changing of the guard ceremony here dates back over 350 years, David continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who truly loved the subject matter. Every day except Sunday, mounted sentries change at 11 o'clock, and the ceremony includes elements that have remained unchanged since the 17th century. Marcus was now standing directly in front of David's position, his face turned upward with complete attention. The boy's earlier disappointment had been replaced by fascination and joy. His mother stood beside him, tears forming in her eyes as she watched her son experience exactly what he had hoped for when he prepared so carefully for this trip. The horses used by the Household Cavalry are primarily Irish draft crosses, David continued, warming to his subject. They undergo 2 years of training before they're ready for ceremonial duties, and many of them serve for over 15 years. Each horse has its own personality and forms a strong bond with its rider. For 20 minutes, David provided a comprehensive tour that covered everything from architectural details to regimental traditions. He explained the significance of different uniform elements, the history of various ceremonies, and the evolution of the Horse Guard's role over the centuries. His information was accurate, detailed, and delivered with the passion of someone who truly understood the importance of preserving history. Marcus asked several questions, his knowledge and preparation evident in the sophistication of his inquiries. David answered each one thoroughly, never breaking his ceremonial posture but clearly engaging with the boy's genuine interest in the subject. Other tourists gathered around to listen, but David's focus remained on the young visitor who had traveled so far to learn about this place. When the police officer returned to inform Marcus and his mother that transportation had been arranged to rejoin the school group, the boy was reluctant to leave. He thanked David formally, using the proper address for a non-commissioned officer that he had clearly learned from his studies. Then, with the confidence that comes from feeling truly welcomed and respected, he asked if he could return someday to learn more. David's response came without hesitation. "This is your history too, young man. You're always welcome here." As Marcus and his mother walked away to meet their transport, David resumed his silent vigil. but word of what had happened spread quickly through the tourist community and social media. Videos taken by impressed visitors would eventually reach the attention of David's superior officers, who faced the same dilemma that military leaders have confronted for generations: how to balance rigid discipline with the human moments that give meaning to service. Rather than face disciplinary action, David would find himself commended for embodying the true spirit of the Horse Guards mission. His impromptu history lesson would become part of the regiment's training examples, showing new guards that their real duty extended far beyond standing still and looking impressive. Marcus would indeed return to Horse Guards Parade 6 months later, this time with his entire family and a much deeper knowledge of cavalry history. David would be on duty that day as well, and the brief nod of recognition between the guard and the young historian would remind everyone present that true service is always personal, always human, and always about connecting the past to the future.